Welcome to High Agency, where we ignite conversations that drive change and spark momentum towards transformative action and professional mastery. So imagine a world where a single person can run a billion-dollar company, where AI threatens to replace 30 to 40% of the workforce, and where the rules of business are changing faster than we can learn them. It's not science fiction, it's obviously the reality that we're all grappling with today. In the 1950s, engineering drafting tables were filled with professionals that were meticulously drawing by hand. And you just fast forward a few decades and an entire profession vanished with the advent of computer-aided design. That's just one of hundreds of examples of industry transformation, and we're facing some of the same today, but maybe on a much grander scale. So consider this. From a quality of life perspective, we're living better than Middle English royalty. Yet many still feel a deep sense of unease about the future. And why is that? It's because we're not just changing the tools we use, we're fundamentally altering the nature of work and how we live. So in the world of business transformation, there's a saying that the game and the rules are changing at the same time. It's like trying to play chess while someone keeps rearranging the board and changing how the pieces move. And amidst this chaos lies opportunity. We're seeing the emergence of some thin wedge strategies where small, focused innovations can crack open the path to large-scale transformations. We're witnessing the tension between the skunkworks approach of isolated innovation teams and the need for organization-wide buy-in for large-scale cultural transformation. So today we're going to talk about all this, the future of work, innovation, and more with Marc Low. Marc's the Director of Innovation, Growth, and Emerging Tech at KPMG Ignition. As a passionate advocate for digital transformation and disruptive technologies, Marc leverages user-centered design principles to create value across industries. He has extensive experience in innovation and strategy consulting. He's worked with industries ranging from the public sector to manufacturing. He's a sought-after lecturer and keynote speaker on topics including intrapreneurship, innovation, design thinking, digital strategy, and the future of work. Welcome, Marc Low.
That guy sounds like a good guest.
Yeah, not bad, right? Well, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, we've been talking to people that are involved in founding companies and entrepreneurship and innovation. And it's largely because, there's a personal curiosity. I really enjoy change. I think a lot about how chaos creates opportunity, right? There's that famous Game of Thrones quote, right?
Yep.
Chaos is a ladder. And, so when we're talking about innovation, when we're talking about change and transformation, it's easy to kind of just dive in and start talking about, what that means to us and how it's impacting us today. Mm-hmm. But what are you excited about right now? Like, we talked about the game and the rules changing at the same time.
Yep.
So maybe tell us a little bit about your role at KPMG Ignition and what you've got going on there.
Sure. So KPMG Ignition is our showcase for innovation emerging tech at KPMG. The gig really is to help clients understand what's coming around the corner and then what to do about that. So, the saying that I like to popularize, right, is how do you take it from 30,000 feet, very abstract, like AI, digital twins, these are just kind of buzzwords, mm-hmm. right? And how do you land that inside your business? What does that mean? And then really, what are you going to do on Monday? And so, my job is, I joke with my boss, feel like I've got maybe he's got the best job in the city. I got the second best job, which is, I get to have my fingers on all the cool stuff that's happening, not only in our city, but across Canada, mm-hmm. with startups that are pushing the envelope on all kinds of interesting things. And then trying to translate that technology into some type of business value for our clients, who tend to be those larger, more established enterprises. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones that are trying to grapple with the change that you're describing, right? Mm-hmm. So that, they're the ones that are trying to figure out like, hey, I've been in business for X decades. I've operated a particular way. You've got some disruptive force coming from the side. What do I do about that? Do I embrace it? Do I defend against it? And so those are the conversations that we have at Ignition. So I feel very, very privileged to be in that seat.
No, I mean, it sounds pretty exciting. Like I would say for anybody that's interested in this world, in entrepreneurship or in helping companies like that lead innovation, I imagine you'd be like a kid in a toy store to some extent, right?
Yes.
Because there's a lot of really interesting things happening, very cool tools to play with. And it sounds like probably exciting and engaged people that are actually interested in making this happen, right? Because nobody,
It's awesome, yeah.
like nobody would be contacting an innovation lab unless they were interested in some change. But there's another aspect of that, which is that sometimes people say they want change.
Yep.
But as long as, nothing really is different, right? As long as nothing really changes.
Well, nobody really actually wants change. Let's just maybe start there.
You think, eh?
Well, the entrepreneurs driving the innovation are motivated to change. I think our sort of natural human sort of stasis, right? Is that if you've got a good thing going, and that's how you structure and finance your business, right? Is you figure out a model, you figure out if that's profitable, and then you figure out how to optimize for that profitability, right? So no organization is geared to change, and we typically don't change until we're forced to change, or there's some shiny object or some promise of a brighter future that goes, hey, I'll experiment there. And that's where a lot of our conversations are coming up now, right? Is people saying, well, like as an example, we talked about generative AI in the prelude to our conversation, but it's a hot topic, so we get executives coming and saying, like, what does this mean? What do I do about it? How impactful is it for my business? Where do I start? Those kind of conversations. But that's more of a function of saying, well, is that going to change the game for me? And that's that sort of lever for change.
Yeah. No, and that's interesting because it doesn't, like, to some extent, the technological change of AI almost isn't, entirely necessary maybe for some industries right now.
Yeah.
But what it's done in terms of being a catalyst for cultural change is pretty interesting, right?
Tell me more about that.
Well, it's just that it has become such a massive topic, rightfully. There's so much change that's already created.
Yeah.
But then there's many industries that just see this wave, this tsunami coming at them.
Right.
So even if in the immediate, they don't necessarily see some technological adoption happening, but what I see is that, like, psychologically, it's opening them up because they can see the crest of the tsunami.
Right.
And so right now they're kind of, getting to high alert and saying, this is coming anyways. And maybe the AI was the catalyst, but what should we be doing? How do we respond to this?
Yeah. Right. Well, what's interesting there, I think, is when we're talking to a company, we do a bunch of research in the market about what organizations are doing around this particular topic, and there's a whole segment of the market that, like, almost half in Canada, almost half of organizations are what we'd say evaluating, which is kind of like, what I think of that is like, you're like peeking through the hedgerows and you're seeing like what other companies are doing, and it's like, is that something I want to experiment with? 10% aren't doing anything at all, which in this era feels like you're just like, okay, you're just waiting to get taken out by something, right? And so, more than half of organizations are really not meaningfully doing that. So it's an interesting tension, right? Of, you see that tsunami coming, you should be doing, you think maybe you should be doing something about it, but half of organizations are still kind of waiting and seeing. So translate that south of the border with our American friends, and much more aggressive in terms of adopting that change, and a much larger sort of cultural push to experiment, even if it means that it's not going to stick, right? They're okay with that sense of, they're much more, I think, at ease with the sense of, we've got to experiment, try things, and see how that's going to kind of affect our organization. In Canada, we tend to want to kind of wait and see, right?
Yeah, we're laggards a little bit, right?
More than a little bit, unfortunately. Yeah, we got a bit of kind of motivating to do some sort of change, a little bit of change management to do there, I think, culturally in Canada.
So that 50% you're talking about, so if it was like, early adopters, early majority, and then maybe late adopters, and then the sort of late majority.
Yes.
You're basically saying that most of us are kind of in that late majority?
So far, that's what it looks like. Yeah, for sure. A third of organizations are piloting something, which is great, right? That's what you want to see. That's that sort of early. In fact, I wouldn't even say they're early adopters. The early adopters are the 10% or so that are scaling stuff already. So they figured out how to make the systems work, how to get change pushed into the organization, how to get people using the tools. They're measuring value and saying, hey, this is working, and they're scaling it. So those are the real, like, early adopters. And then about a third of organizations from our research, are sitting in that place where they're experimenting with something that could be like a Microsoft Copilot, or maybe they're using ChatGPT for a couple of use cases. And so they're trying to figure that out, but they're not necessarily, they haven't proven that value yet, or they haven't gotten comfortable with what that means for the organization. So
there's something you said there, which I think, sometimes we say very quickly in passing and move on to the next thing, which is the tool or the solution or the technology you want to talk about. But you said they're getting people to buy into the change.
Yes.
Right. Let's unpack that, because I feel like that might be most of the work, right?
How much time do we have?
Because when it comes to the technology, like that, for the most part, you can figure it out.
Yes.
You can find ways of integrating. You can see what makes sense for you. The analysis exists, but getting people to buy into the change, that to me seems like it might be most of the work.
It's the whole game.
It's the whole game.
Yeah.
So how do you get people to buy in?
Well, you make it all about them, right?
You appeal to the inherent narcissism of the.
Well, why do you embrace anything, right? Why do you, I saw before we sat down here, right? You've got an iPhone, you're sitting on an iPad, right? Why do you use that iPad instead of a paper notebook, right? Apple has figured out how to create a product that has enough inherent value for you're going to make a change, right? And I think that's like fundamental to any of this. Think about doing something like a Salesforce implementation as an example, right? Forget about AI and all this other stuff. You don't. I think if you start from the premise of, hey, we're doing a Salesforce implementation, it's like people go, oh God, right? Because nobody wants to change, right? They've done things a certain way. Yeah. Organizations are geared for stasis primarily. So that's where you set it up for failure. So what you have to unlock the why of why we're doing this, and then getting people to buy into that why and the change and how that's going to make their lives better, right? Salesforce, as an example, you do that because you want to change the way that you interact with your customers. I feel like I'm repping Salesforce huge here in this interview.
And Apple. So
right?
you're
Yeah,
great with the brands.
All the good brands, right? But it's never technology for technology's sake, right? And I think that's the trap. I mean, we've seen that in AI for sure. And that's where digital transformations tend to fail, is you talk technology first, technology, people, process, or technology, process, people. And it's got to be the other way around, which people, then process, then technology, right? And the technology is the last piece of that. So how do you get it to succeed? You get people bought in around the why. You create try to create a vivid picture of how their life is going to be star-spangled awesome at the end of this change, right? And then you support them in that change. So again, it's like not about pushing technology into somebody. It's about empowering them with tools and training and support and mentorship and all that stuff that makes you feel like, okay, I can do this. Any technological change is the same type of change that you'd engage in any other part of your life. But because we're technologists and we interact with this stuff all the time, the trap is to think, well, the technology speaks for itself.
Yeah.
The iPad's so awesome that
it's
obviously I would ditch my paper notepad for that. But there's a whole dynamic to how you get people bought in around that and then support them in that change.
So I'm super guilty of that, because when it comes to operations or automation,
right?
You discover a tool, a piece of software, some technique, and
do it this way.
Yeah, the new feature to me just becomes so evident so fast,
right?
That I am very guilty of just running around and beating people over the head with the technology from then on. And luckily, we have a small enough operation here at Skyrocket that it can be run as a mostly benevolent dictatorship. So we can get away with that. But I imagine at a large enterprise, organizations of 100, 500 people plus, that these are, living organisms almost. And getting people to adopt change, sure, there's a lot of recruitment that can happen, but there's also an aspect of even figuring out what needs to be done before that.
Yes.
And one of the favorite examples I like drawing is actually from Salim Ismail from Singularity University.
Yep.
And he put it so well when he said that because a large organization really walks and talks and breathes much like an organism, that new ideas are treated like pathogens.
Right.
And when a new idea is introduced, it feels like a pathogen to the company. And then culturally, subconsciously, pathogen, fighting antibodies will be sent to kill off this infection.
Yeah.
Right. So when you're working in an enterprise like that, like how do you first even arrive at what should that innovation, what should that change be, let alone getting to the point of buy-in?
Well, it depends. It depends what it is. I think that's the first kind of comment, right? So, in our innovation work, we tend to talk about it kind of in three horizons, right? So, the first being just optimize your business of today, right? And that's the type of thing where it's more constrained to a group, like, let's pick a practical example. So rolling out generative AI as an initiative. If it's something like primarily focused on how the business works today, it's tend to be constrained within a group. So, your IT group, for example, might drive that. Second horizon being that stuff where you're looking to kind of explore new markets, new products, right? And that tends to be a little bit broad in the organization. And then the stuff that's really transformative needs to be driven typically out of the executive suite. So it depends. It kind of depends what the nature of that sort of change is. That's the first kind of comment, right? And I should also preface all these comments with, one of the brilliant things about being at an organization like KPMG is I'm surrounded by people way cleverer than me who do that type of change management type work, all day long, right? So, it's very, very fortunate to be surrounded by people who are literal experts in that, PhD level experts in these domains. So I'm going to give you the, my kind of innovation version of what professionals do at KPMG, right? But the next piece, I think, is really about understanding, who are the groups that you're working with, and spending a lot of time up front making those personal connections. So trying to understand what motivates people, right? To your point, organizations are just groups of people coming together to achieve some type of shared outcome. And within those, you've got a whole variety of personalities, motivations, and so on. So the work, when it's done well, is spending a bit of time understanding and mapping what those personality structures are within those groups that you're going to be operating with, and trying to form those personal kind of connections or bonds. Right? We're gearing up to do something together. Even if I'm coming as an outsider into your organization, we're going to band together to achieve this outcome. My job is to articulate that brighter future that we're going to go and fetch together. And then understanding who are the people that are going to be supporters in that, who are the people that are going to be detractors, who are the people that are going to be skeptics, and so on. And then you've got to play to each one of those groups to bring them along in that journey. And sometimes it doesn't work, right? Sometimes the skeptics are too loud or too influential, right? And that's when those type of engagements tend to derail. And you do see that, right? I mean, statistically, the vast majority of digital transformations, and that's a big bucket term, right? But they tend to fail, right? And mostly, I think that's because the human dynamic hasn't been solved for. And you think you're pushing a technology solution, or you're saying, our future is going to be so much brighter, and you haven't done the work of, meeting somebody where they are and doing that kind of empathy work, the human work that needs to get done to get stuff landed. And that's when those things tend to derail.
It's interesting actually, because you talk to people in leadership that are leading technological change, and they tend to want to talk about the technology, and most of their reaction and responses are to the technology.
Right.
And you talk to people that work in digital transformation or technical innovation, and they want to talk about the people and the human side. Right. We've had other guests on previously that are deep in the digital transformation space. Yeah. And the conversation is entirely around humans and people and how they work, and sometimes internal to the organization, because you're ultimately coming to bring technological change. Their focus winds up being entirely on technology, and that's all they want to talk about.
Yes.
So I'm reminded of this really actually kind of funny quote from Osho. It's like Eastern spiritual philosopher who said that, what did he say? He said, every time I talk to a prostitute, they want to talk about God. And every time I talk to a priest, they want to talk about sex. And it's this weird dichotomy where, the technology change is actually human change. Right. And right now we've got the biggest sort of looming thing in front of us, which is AI, which is triggering everybody to even have these conversations in the first place. So imagine the innovation space itself has probably heated up a lot. I mean, you've been at this for some time. So what have you seen even in the last couple of years in terms of the appetite in companies to have this conversation?
Well, I mean, AI, you're quite right. I mean, in our line of work, AI has completely changed the narrative. That sort of 3 horizon model that I was describing. I think we've been working in some form of that paradigm I've been doing work in that sort of domain for more than a decade now, probably. Right. And
now suddenly everybody's like all horizon 3.
That's actually an interesting one, right? So, well, I mean, everyone wants that promise, I think, but that means a lot of change. And I think where organizations are largely, so, we've kind of, in my mind, I demarcate the market into kind of the folks who are focused on optimizing their system operation, and the ones that are, pushing the boundaries or innovating. The innovation conversation, the real change, how are we going to change the organization? Are we going to change our business model and so on? Those are big, hairy, sticky conversations. And it's good to have that as an aspiration, but most of the work tends to be in that kind of, explain to me. So the line that we always get, right? So Around generative AI, we've been working now for like 18, 20 months or so, helping clients understand what it means. And we've documented like 850 use cases for generative AI inside organizations. Now, like that's the literal tip of the iceberg, right? Because if you think about even inside Skyrocket, the number of cognitive processes that are happening inside Skyrocket, it's in the thousands for sure, right? And if you talk to like a Coca-Cola or a Loblaws or something, it's way
Orders
bigger
of magnitude,
right?
Yeah.
So everyone wants to know like what are the use cases for my function or my organization, my industry, right? That's kind of only part of the discussion. It's again, it's about how's it going to change the way that work gets done, right? So anyway, it depends a little bit on on where that kind of starts inside the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When we were talking previously, you talked about some of the tools that you've been using to kind of recruit people into that change and get the conversation started. And again, this is different than my strategy of just beating people over the head with a tool,
which I doubt very much, by the way. Knowing you as I do, I don't think that's the approach at all. I'm sure.
That's generous. I appreciate that. But starting with like what parts of your job really suck, right? Because when you talk
my job or just in general?
Oh no, just in general, because your job sounds pretty amazing.
My job is amazing.
But in terms of the cognitive processes you're talking about, really we're talking about cognitive load, right? And that's something that even small enterprises are challenged with, because there's 1,000 micro decisions you're making, and certain things you want to be automatic because they're not high value, and you want to be actually taking most of your human energy, which is a very finite resource, and has to be managed very carefully, increasingly. But you want to take most of your human energy and actually apply it where that special insight is needed, right? We don't want to be making decision fatigue, essentially, right? You don't want to be making 1,000 useless decisions. So when you get that first conversation started with a client and with their internal team of what parts of your job suck, what do you do when someone doesn't know, right? Because I think sometimes it's easy to point at something and say, okay, this is a real pain point. But there's also areas where people just get so used to doing things a certain way that they don't even realize that this is a kind of waste of their time or their life, right? Like we had a great project management conversation a couple episodes ago, and before project management even came along as a methodology in the 50s, right? The normal way was you just kind of keep talking to each other until the thing happens, right? And you have to repeat a conversation 20 times, so be it. But that was just the norm. And if you talk to somebody that was working in a factory in those days and said, what are the pain points in your job? They might have said, well, it's really muddy when I'm walking to work, right? But the inherent aspect of just being really redundant with conversation and trying to move projects forward that way, they wouldn't have necessarily pointed at that as a pain point, right? And today it might be that I know one of my pain points is building spreadsheets. So I worked with many project managers or others that are in some job of needing to organize humans and resources around something. And we'll immediately get to the work of constructing, big, complicated.
What's the work back? And,
right. And I kind of look at that and I think, that's the norm. They haven't necessarily looked at that as a pain point, right? That's just how they're getting the work done. But I look at it and I say, what a waste of human energy to be building these things that are sometimes redundant and repeating a lot of the same information that exists in other places. So how do you even get the conversation started when somebody is so locked into a mode of thinking that when you ask for a pain point, they might not even look at their own, what they're doing or where they're kind of wasting themselves?
Well, may I share a slightly different perspective on that story? So I was about to give you the trope about, the consulting joke is it depends. Right? But I mean, so it does depend in that there are certain processes which from the outside might look like a waste of time. And some people need those processes to wrap their mind around what needs to get done. And so the art is to figure out, to listen well, which sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, right? But, to really like listen empathetically to what's happening in your, so if I ask you to describe your Monday to Friday, and we start to lay that out and we map those processes and what are the outcomes you're trying to drive, and you're looking for value levers in that work that say, how do I, are you clear about what needs to get, when you get to Friday at 5 o'clock, right? What does success look like for your week? And are we mapping those activities back? sometimes there are going to be activities in there that feel like, oh man, like if I didn't have to do that thing. I'll tell you how my mind works often. If somebody ran that process back with me, oftentimes the way that I need to get to, if I'm constructing, if I'm building a keynote or building a piece of thought leadership, I have to go through the reps of doing that research and grind and thinking about what that argument is to get to that output. If somebody says, oh, but all that time I see on your Monday to Friday, right? Friday you said you were going to have this keynote built, but you spent 4 hours doing research and synthesizing arguments. That Gen AI could do that for you. If I skip that step,
you don't wrap your head around it.
I don't get to the end, right? And so even in your example of creating that work back schedule, depending on your position in the organization and the way that you need to get to your output, sometimes that's a useful process for you to get done. And so the art is in the listening of going, okay, explain what that work is, what that cognitive load that you're describing is. And now let's map that back to what outcomes you need to get and how you synthesize information to get to that output, right? And the art is in distilling which ones of those are stuff that can be stripped away by a piece of technology and which ones the person, because of the way their mind is geared, actually needs to do that to do their job effectively.
Yeah.
The tension, I think, is in when you're looking at it from a top-down view. The management would say, well, if I could replace that piece of work, if I could strip out that 4 hours with a piece of technology or somebody could do that more effectively, I'll just make that decision. That's, I think, where things get kind of sticky, right? Because that's you're talking about, well, what's the optimum use of the organization's value, right? Because they're paying for that time, and what's the optimum use of that person's kind of cognitive ability? Yeah. But those two are at these conversations actually different conversations, I think. Yeah. And make for the harder conversations about what it means to change organizations when you apply technology. Anyways, I've gone off a little bit of a rabbit hole there, but I think it's an important kind of distinction in terms of not everything. My point is, I guess, is not everything is a kind of management consulting oriented, like, how many hours for what dollars equals output. Let's just rip and replace that thing. Yeah. Because it fundamentally undermines how that team structure works. And that's the tension for leaders and navigating this change.
And I think actually there's a lot of light bulbs going off for me in this. I feel like you should bill yourself as like a change therapist, because this conversation has actually been really helpful for me, even because I think there's a personal dynamic in that's probably been missing for me a little bit, of looking at activities, looking at actions that we take, right, and which ones are driving outcome, without necessarily appreciating very thoughtfully and empathetically, as you have, of what the individual needs might be to how to process and understand that change. Right. But no, I think that's super helpful. I think as a result of that, Monday morning, the team at Skyrocket is going to encounter a kinder and gentler Mo Dhaliwal.
There you go. You're welcome, Skyrocket.
So let's just go on a bit of a tangent for a bit.
Yeah.
Because we're talking a lot about present day, what you've got going on. It's all quite exciting. And I think any one of the things we've touched on, we could talk for 2 hours about. But I'm also really curious to hear about why you're doing what you do. Right. Right. Because there's certain natural inclinations that have landed you in this role. Right. I've seen your trajectory in the world of startups, and before that, working always in problem solving and building spaces. Yeah. And I'm just curious to hear about like why this world interested you at all. Why Marc Low? Yeah. Why now? Yeah. Why are you doing this?
Geez. Now you're the change therapist. I love going from 0 to 1 on stuff. I love the intellectual challenge of trying to unpack a market dynamic, try to place a solution inside of that, and ultimately how to create value. Like when you're the active, like I came up in sales and marketing really effectively early in my career, and so my the end goal is always how do you identify some value. And the sales process is about how do I make your life better as a result of the solution that I bring. If I do that well, I'll get compensated for it, right? So all the work that I've done really for the last sort of 10, 12 years has been around either helping organizations like, I've spent a lot of time now in big four consulting firms, but it's always been in that sort of 0 to 1 space of creating new ventures and that, or in helping organizations kind of grapple with the same, right? By choice. I haven't spent a lot of time doing, I haven't built my career in like ERP implementations where the solution set's really known and the problem definition is pretty well done. I like to spend time in that kind of ambiguous space. But the less satisfying answer is it really has been, my career has been a series of very fortuitous kind of outcomes that weren't, I wasn't sitting in high school designing it this way. I'm the classic example of very fortunate to meet great people along the way that opened up certain, little cracks in the door that gave me a view of something interesting. And then, I've been, fortunate enough to kind of follow those bits of inspiration, right? Early in my career, came up with an organization here in Vancouver called Vision Critical, which is now a company called, they've rebranded to Alita. But like early days of SaaS software solutions, and nobody even knew what that was. We were kind of one of the first companies articulating what that meant to, not have an on-prem installation of software. And so I was early in my career and watching really, really clever people try to grapple with like what that meant. How do you figure out messaging? How do you message change and innovation in interesting ways and articulate what that value proposition is for a client, and build a market, right? And saw how hard that was, and just had, amazing examples that I still lean on. And I mean, that company has birthed into Vancouver. Yeah. We talked a little bit, before we sat down, right, of how small the market is. And, there's still guys that I roll with out of that group that I met, I won't even say how long ago now. It's, it's a bit of a commentary on Vancouver and the market there, but just, great people that I kind of watched. And then, what I was seeing there was the guys that were having the really strategic conversations were credentialed. And so my thought was, okay, well, I'll go get a credential. So I went and did an MBA, and then I met, the chief innovation officer for Deloitte at the time. And just one of these like super dynamic guys who just his personality fills the room, right? And just articulated to me like, hey, I've got this great mandate to go and rock some boats and create some change and help clients do some stuff. I was like, man, that sounds awesome, right? And that begat another kind of 5-year stretch of working with organizations to do that. And big, like when we talk about those 3 horizons, that third horizon transformation stuff, right? How does a bank with 150 years of legacy, completely transform their business model? Those type of engagements. So it was like really intellectually challenging, the classic long hours, hard work, big demands, but made me grow so much, right? So I just had a series of those type of experiences. And so, but the golden thread has always been that kind of, either building stuff 0 to 1 or helping organizations do that. And it's just such a great kind of challenge to do that. And that's why the work's been interesting. So that's what it continues to be. At KPMG, it's topics like digital twins and generative AI, and how do you help an organization grapple with that and then bring that to life, right? Sometimes you're not even totally sure what the question is that you're answering when you start. And it's about, framing that in a way you go, okay, now we understand what we're trying to solve for. Now let's talk about who are the people that are going to be solving for that. And then what's the right solution to do that? And how do you build that kind of together, right? So the classic, like build the plane as you fly. You just jump off the cliff and strap a couple of wings to your arms. And then you just try to stay afloat, right? That's it's an awesome challenge.
You get quite excited when you're talking about it. Like it's apparent on your face. You're glowing. The interesting thing for me, and I think there's a bit of a pattern emerging here as well, is nobody really works in these spaces unless you're inherently an optimist, right? Like this is a space for optimists. It's for people with a growth mindset. Because if the first time you encountered a challenge or the first time you saw a gap, your natural instinct was to retreat or see a threat there. Right. You just there's no starting. Yeah. Right? There's no getting over that. Yeah. So there's an inherent optimism that you see in entrepreneurship, intrapreneurship, and innovation spaces. Yeah. And that's, I think, been a pretty common thread for anybody I've talked to. I'm sure. CEOs we work with, it's inherent. But what were your sort of influences growing up? Like why the optimism? Why looking at challenges with excitement rather than fear and trepidation?
I think I describe myself professionally as like a techno optimist, right? I think I'm a bit of a reluctant optimist in some ways.
A reluctant optimist?
Yeah. Is that a thing? I don't know. Maybe I'm inventing the term. So, your upbringing always influences, or it typically influences, right, how your view of the world. I'm blessed with amazing parents, but I think a dad who has I think a bit of a view of like, are we really getting, are we really getting better? Are we improving? Like, is this, and so I've always got a bit of that voice in my head of like, I think a healthy amount of skepticism, especially when I hear, people pitch new solutions or, kind of solutions in search of a problem, a bit of that sort of healthy skepticism of like, is this really, are we going to be better at the end of this? Right. So, that's kind of the one lens. And then on the other side of it, having just spent a lot of time in the technology space, like the challenge of bringing those solutions to market, to bring those to life, right? Those are good, that's just intellectually stimulating for me. But I've also, because I spent a chunk of in the middle of my career overseas in South Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa, I've also seen the ability for technology to really drive positive change, where people want it. I think, very sensitive of like cultural dynamics of kind of that Western view of like, technology is going to make your life better. Like, well, maybe not. Maybe they want it, maybe they don't, right? But in the places where, where they do want it, man, I mean, the ability in Africa, right? The ability to, provide access to electricity in rural environments, right? And what that means for somebody's, standard, can mean for somebody's standard of living, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So like real base level stuff, right? Now I'm not talking about putting a Starlink, internet on their, in their rural village. It's like just some of the basics and the change that can have, the profound change that can have. So I kind of see that as the thread that pulls all the way through, right? Is that I've seen the ability for technology to drive that really fundamental change and make an impact in people's lives. And the work that we do here, I got to say, is like the impact is not the same, right? It's like just because of the dynamic at play, you're dealing with a different set of problems. But the fundamental thing remains the same, which is like, do you believe that life can get better by virtue of deploying a great technology solution? My answer to that is yes. And the cynicism is, I think, a good healthy dose of it, right?
Well, check and balance of like, is it getting better?
Not technology for technology's sake, right? It's like, how's your life going to get better as a result of this solution? And that's, so take a practical example is, helping an organization deploy generative AI. It's like, it's not just about pushing it in there and saying, because everyone reads the headlines, they know they can see the disruption coming. They say, like classic joke, right? If you got a department of 3 people and the headline is 33% of jobs are going to be redundant, like you're looking, going, well, which one of the 3 of us is going to be the one that's going to get, right? And so empathy there to say like, what impact is this going to have for you? How do I make your day better by, virtue of having put this technology in place? And then how do we support you to be part of your change journey? Even if that change journey means ultimately you're not going to be inside this organization at some point, right? You leave with a different set of skills. I think you have to have that lens when you do this. You need to do this kind of work. I won't be prescriptive. I just think I like having that lens around it. It makes me feel like I've got agency. Right around this change. It makes me feel like I've got a positive impact when I'm helping organizations talk about these things and deploy these things. So it's part of what kind of rounds the circle for me a bit.
I mean, from a values perspective, like I think you should have that perspective that you're describing of the societal impacts, good and potential adjustment that might be needed and necessary. And that's definitely the opportunity with technology for sure. But I mean, even at the start of this segment, I started with this like Sam Altman quote, right? We're in an era where we're going to see the first, one-person billion-dollar company.
Right.
And I think for a lot of very aggressive techno optimists, the opportunity it's a highly individualized one. Right. It's about how do we actually eliminate, and become ever more lean, ever fewer people, ever more profitable and productive, and making waves out there.
Right.
And the two seem to sort of be at odds, right? Because one is actually saying that it's almost like a retreat from humanity to the individual.
Yep.
And the other is saying, actually, these are massive waves and tsunamis of change that are coming upon us. And we actually have to see who all they're affecting and how to mitigate and have empathy for that, for that effect, right? And like, you know, it's a paradox because the two kind of seem to be in opposition to each other.
I think they are fundamentally in opposition. Yeah. Yeah.
And so how do you navigate that? Like, is there some dissonance around saying, well, you know, all this stuff is good, but we're becoming like, we're only really kind of looking at the individual benefit. Right?
I mean, I gotta say, I love the conversation, right? I think that's where the real juice, the juice of it is. And first comment, I think, is the pendulum is swinging in one direction. It has for almost, a couple of decades probably, right? You know, if you kind of draw a line from like the first .com boom and bust, right? Through the 2000s, right? Technology was really coming online in the mainstream. You had all these great innovations that were coming to the fore. Great financial crisis, right? It has this devastating effect on the economy, and then kind of rebuilding out of that, and then pulling all the way through to COVID, right? All these forces were fundamentally kind of attacking that legacy view of what organizations were, right? And what people accepted as like a reasonable profit margin for work, right? So you put $1 in the top of revenue, and you pay all the people, and then the owners would keep 15-ish%, right? That was that's if you extrapolate out against a variety of industries, that was more or less than that. And all these forces have come to really disaggregate those organizational forces. We came together because we thought Ronald Coase wrote this book in the early 1900s, The Theory of the Firm, and the whole idea was why wouldn't Mo and Marc just be out in the metaphorical wilderness, right, hunting and killing what we can. And the answer is that in certain circumstances, it makes sense for us to join forces in the same way that you would, civilization came together in the first place, right? We've got a shared set of skills. And so firms were this aggregation of skills where you're better together. And there was value you could create there. The solutions were better. You created a brand, and that had had market forces attached to it that would allow you to win work, et cetera, right? And technology has been this force that's actually been kind of disaggregating that in some significant ways. COVID, I think one of the big lessons of COVID, right, was that we said, okay, work from home, and it was like this overnight, COVID hit, and it's like, cool, everyone used to come to work. I mean, 5 days a week in the office was the standard thing. COVID hit, everyone went home. Well, what were you doing there? You were starting to compartmentalize people's individual roles and responsibilities. You're starting to, itemize what pieces of work they were doing, right? Well, the next version of that is then go, okay, well, hang on a second. If I can really quantify what this person does, then the next decision, if what you're looking at is how do I maximize my profit, my next decision is, okay, well, how do I get a cheaper, better version of that, right? I'll go find that person in a cheaper geography. I'll replace that with a piece of technology and so on. And then generative AI has kind of been this extension of that force in some capacity, right? Is to go, great. It's talking about how do you replace elements of work, and how can I drive more profit from that, right? These are all positive forces. Like this, nothing exists in a vacuum, but it's exactly what you described. Is I think they're antithetical forces in some way. Because the idea of a one-person billion-dollar company is absolutely antithetical to that Ronald Coase version, theory of the firm story of there's value in people coming together, having a human experience, banding together with their shared kind of collective wisdom, and then pushing a solution to the market that creates value and can sell value and retain some level of profit. So,
well, I mean, the COVID frame there is actually quite profound what you mentioned, because I've never actually heard it articulated so clearly, right? Because pre-remote work revolution, it was people first, right? You hired people came to the company, and then you decide what the people are going to do, right? And then when it went remote and now it was function based, now it was function first, and then as a result you have a withdrawal of that humanity, and now you're looking to figure out where and how, and I'm sure I've been guilty of this, of where and how to identify functions and automate them, right?
And if I just interject 1 second there, right? I mean, like we're seeing the impacts of that in terms of how organizations function now. So, firms like KPMG, like one of the things that we're working really hard to rebuild is that sort of connective tissue of teams, right? Because really, actually, every meeting is a default remote first meeting because not everyone is in the office at the same time. So every meeting has we work on Microsoft Teams. So everything is a Teams meeting by default, and some people might be in the same room. That has really profound impacts on, if you're coming out of university, entering our firm, the way that you used to do it is you would watch a partner interact with a client, sell work, manage the client relationship, right? Project manage, right? How do you figure out how much effort's required to deliver this piece of work? And then how do you manage that when your plan inevitably gets thrown out the window because the dynamics change, in the heat of battle? All of that has been really, put on pause. And so it's challenging for us now to kind of regain that team momentum. Like I think we're doing a good job of it, but it requires this, conscious effort to do that, right? And so, all these sort of things are really in tension with, what you're trying to do as an organization. And if you think that the only thing that you're trying to do is deliver the end solution for X dollars and retain profit, if that's your sort of corporate view of what the role of that organization is, then of course you're going to go function by function and go, what's the most efficient way to do that? And business is the act of, selling somebody value, taking $1, retaining some profit at the end of that, right? That's the gig of a capitalist system. So of course there should be elements of that, right? But it can't just be the thing of, well, how do I get to the absolute most efficient way to do that, right? Because take that to the nth degree, that's Sam Altman's comment, right? Of the one-person billion-dollar organization. Great if you're a venture capitalist, right? That's the view of the world. It's like, how can I put in the least amount of money and get the maximum return? Well, that's taken to the nth degree, right? That's what he's articulating there. But that is fundamentally at odds with why we come together as humans to explore, create, build something that hasn't been built before, and then put these solutions in the market. And you started the intro saying, we live better now than royalty did in the Middle Ages. Well, we do because humans have come together to create those solutions, right? And that's how you've created value. Is people have come together, understood somebody's human experience, created something that didn't exist before, and then built that thing. And that's why our lives are better, right? So I think this idea that we can break all this apart into its component pieces and just just get it down to its bare essence. I think that's ultimately a recipe for a little bit of disaster. And so that's what we're trying to navigate in this period of change. Is you do have this technology that promises the one-person billion-dollar company. How do you hold that tension, right? In terms of the work that you do and what that impact can be on organizations.
I feel like this is a conversation that's actually missing from all the discourse around technological change, AI, everything that's happening, right? The humanity of it. Because if you just looked at the discourse, you would imagine that humanity was always just hunter-gatherers. Right. And I wouldn't know this had I not researched it for a presentation to an agricultural group.
Right.
But 12,000 years ago, we decided to give up hunting and gathering, which was actually low calorie expenditure for a high calorie return for the individual or for the small unit. We gave that up for an activity that was actually like massive calorie expenditure for low return, which is farming. But farming needed larger communities to actually sustain it. But as a result, we became more sustainable as a species. So that act of coming together, that act of creating a shared wealth and a shared resilience is actually the whole reason why civilization exists. But I feel especially us technocrats on some level are kind of mired in this blindness of privilege, I guess. Right. Of just assuming that if you're out for yourself and if you're enabling yourself with technology and becoming this like centaur of like half human, half technologist, superhero, that then you'll be able to become very individually powerful. And that's actually the desired state. Right. And I think what's actually missing from current conversations around AI and the rest of it, like we talk about impact, but we're not really talking as much about shared humanity.
Well, It depends. I think the point's well taken, right? That's why I say thinking of it like a pendulum that's kind of swung in one direction, I think is useful, right? The folks that are pushing that are invested in the technology, finding a home, that's the narrative that you're seeing on that one side, right? There are also, there's a whole community of people who are exploring what this means and having really interesting conversation, fundamentally, philosophically interesting conversation about what the impact of that technology is. And the other thing I'd say is, nothing is happening in a kind of uniform way, right? So our you and I work in technology. We're talking about technology in our day-to-day work, right? But there's bound to be kind of almost counterculture, reactions to the stuff where people are going almost that sort of Luddite kind of
the other extreme,
right? Of no, and I think because the narrative around the impact of the technology, and it's so star-spangled awesome and it's so amazing, and that we think it's easy to think that it's going to be uniformly adopted, right? And there's still lots of people who don't have iPads and iPhones and whatever, right? And I think the same will likely be true here. If you zoom out at a sort of civilizational level or at a cultural level, right? I think the question is, if you are working with a piece of technology like AI, and you know that it has transformative impacts, and you know there's going to be a whole section of people that are not interested, don't have access, what does that mean? Are you going to create a sort of increase that stratification, that gap? Those are the sort of I think those are the really important conversations to be having, or at least to be having in your mind as you're driving these conversations into into organizations, right? And so that's why I love the even the title of your podcast, right? High agency. It's this idea of how can you hold the tension of knowing how good the technology is and knowing what impact it can have, and having a view of there's no such thing as impact without some sort of significant outcome, and those outcomes can be positive and negative, and you should be mindful of both, right? And if you do, to your point, if you're doing your job well, I think that you're holding that tension in a kind of meaningful way, and what I like about the work that we get to do is to have agency in that story, right? I don't feel like I'm a passive consumer of consequence. I feel like I've got a voice.
You're not the effect of things. You're actually able to shape something. Yeah.
Super, super important, right? You mentioned in your introduction, right? This sense of there's a bit of a narrative of people feeling like they're locked out, or even though if you're objective about it, we're living better, it doesn't feel that way sometimes. And I think a lot of that has to do with that a feeling like you're at effect of the world, right? That things are happening out there, and that I'm a consumer of the consequence of whatever those decisions are, and I don't have voice in that. And so that to me is a super, super important lens around technology, and what we try to do with the work that we do is to have a positive voice in that change, not just ramming down technology for technology's sake and damn the consequences, right? It's the work that you do, if you're talking about AI and it's got impacts on jobs, that's people's livelihoods, that's how they feed their families, right? these are not no consequence discussions, right? And so being empathetic and mindful of that, and then doing the work in a way where you feel like you are adding value, I think is really, really important. So I feel very lucky to be able to do it that way.
Awesome. Well, Marc, thanks for your time. Thanks for coming in. Where can we learn more about you?
Well, obviously the KPMG website, and if you are so inclined, there is also a personal website, marclow.com, where I post some of the work that I'm doing, which is also a great place to learn a little bit more, and obviously LinkedIn and all the socials. But yeah, what a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the great conversation.
Awesome. Thanks for coming in, Marc.
The pleasure was mine.
All right. Thanks so much. Well, hopefully we've given you a lot to think about. That was High Agency. Like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.